Hey everyone, thanks for coming to this second feedback session that we have for the Backstage community. The intent of these sessions is primarily for us, actually, to get feedback on stuff that we're releasing. I think we've been pretty clear early on saying that we really want Backstage to become sort of a strong community, and we're intent on listening to what you need. We built Backstage internally and have been using it in production for many years at Spotify, but as we're realizing now, it's kind of a different thing to provide the solution that works for other companies as well. Not surprising, but still. So that's why we really are keen on hearing if we're on track, if we're up with what we are developing, which is very much similar to what we have internally at Spotify. If that works for all of you. So that's why we have these sessions. I'm Stefan. I'm the product manager for Backstage. I have been at Spotify for 3.5 years, something like that, working on Backstage and other developer tools for the majority of the time. This is the agenda for today. First of all, the introductions. Then we're going to go through some demos. I'm going to demo what we call the Backstage Service Catalog, which we recently released in alpha, which we think is sort of the most requested feature from the community so far, and we're really happy to be able to provide an early glimpse of that so that you can try it out and give us feedback. Then I'm going to attempt demoing what we call the creation flow, or naming to be decided still, but basically the way we envision you creating software components in Backstage and putting stuff into this catalog in a standardized way. And then we have the pleasure of welcoming Emma from our TechDocs team. She will demo one of the core plugins that we have inside Spotify, which is called TechDocs, which is the way we do technical documentation at Spotify, which is also now being open sourced. And then hopefully we'll spend the majority of the time in questions and answering your questions and feedback and having a discussion. So I hope everyone is ready to lean in and can write down whatever questions you have. All right. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with Backstage, which I'm assuming most of you are at this stage, at least if you joined this, Backstage is Spotify's homegrown developer portal. And internally at Spotify, it has become almost like a marketplace or a app store for your developer tools. We have, rather than having our infrastructure spread out in various smaller islands, we have been able to centralize and consolidate pretty much all of our infrastructure UI touchpoints into one single interface. So now today we have over 130 different what we call plugins, and all of them are available in Backstage. So we have some teams. On one hand, we have developers on what we call platform or infrastructure teams who are building and adding things into Backstage. And then on the other side, we have end users of this, which are basically the software engineers at Spotify who are working in autonomous small engineering teams who are using Backstage on a daily basis to build software. And what we have seen inside Spotify is that Backstage really helps us to scale the way we build software. It has allowed us to stay fast and nimble, even though we're big, and it has also allowed us to standardize the way we build software, so that every small team does not have to decide their own tooling or their own ways to build software. We believe strongly in autonomous teams, but we don't think teams should be autonomous in choosing whatever tools they need and whatever frameworks they should build in. That's not good for the company long term. And Backstage is a way for us to create these standardized ways of managing and creating software. And we believe that this is a sort of a fundamental problem, at least that's what we're hearing from all of you that we're talking to, is that this is not a unique Spotify problem of tooling proliferation and sort of fragmentation. So we think Backstage can long-term really become this UI or UX layer that ties together different infrastructures, services, and tools into one consistent experience. We've been talking about it as the Kubernetes of developer experience. That's a bit like it's a strong statement, but at least that gives us sort of the vision that we're looking for. So when we released Backstage, it wasn't really representative of the internal deployment we have at Spotify. The primary thing that was missing when we released it was what we call the service catalog. So at the core of Backstage is a software or service catalog where ownership and basically all our software is managed and represented in Backstage. And the way we do that is by having these what we call service definition files, or the YAML files that you keep close to your code. So every software repository at Spotify has one of these YAML files that describes who the owner is and what kind of software it is, etc. Those small service definition files are then being registered, as we call it, inside Backstage. And then that means that everyone in the company can find it and they can see who's owning what services and what software in general. The trick here is that what we have found is that this service catalog is also a fantastic way to kind of organize all the various tools that we have. So rather than asking someone to jump into our CI tool or our experimentation platform, they don't do that as distinct different services, but rather you do that by going through the software catalog. So if I want to see the builds of a specific service, I click the service in service catalog, and then I get to the tools available for that. And the tools then are basically built as, that's what we call the plugins. So on top of the service catalog, we've been able to manage and then sort of to integrate a lot of different various tools. And that's how we keep sort of the consistency between the tools, and also reduces the number of things that an engineer needs to know about. So an engineer, they reason about their services or data pipelines or libraries. And in Backstage, they have all the tools they need to manage those entities. So I'm going to demo that very shortly. Actually now. So if you haven't seen, we have a lot of the open source version is still very limited compared to the Spotify internal version. And we've published a bunch of different videos showing how Backstage is used internally, and then all the various plugins. So you can see them on backstage.io/demos. Something that we have spent quite a lot of time on, which is not a very nice and sexy feature, but nonetheless something that is super important for a platform like Backstage, is to figure out how sign-in and authentication should work. So at Spotify, we use Google to sign in our users, but not everyone is running their things on Google Cloud Platform. So what we've been doing behind the scenes is working on a more pluggable authentication flow. So basically, regardless of what kind of authentication mechanism you have inside your company, you should be able to configure your Backstage deployment with those authentication providers, and allow your users to sign in with whatever you typically use in your company. And since we have added Google and GitHub, we've actually gotten contributions from the community, which we're extremely happy about. So we have gotten contributions for Okta recently, and also actually today, I think we got another contribution for GitLab as well. So if you're using GitLab and not GitHub, you can also sign in your user with that, which is fantastic. And we envision all different, Amazon, whatever different providers you use and have that you need to build sign in for, should be fairly straightforward now to do, to add another authentication provider. For now, I'll sign in as a guest user, and So this is the landing page for Backstage, which is the service catalog. I'm greeted in Russian, so hopefully we have some Russian friends here today, like randomizing this. And here I can see what we call the service catalog or the software catalog then. So I have all the services, I have all the websites in the system. I don't have any that I own. Libraries, documentation, et cetera, et cetera. This is like, I have a question for you all in the end, like what kind of domains or software like types do you think you will use Backstage for? Something to think about. But then in any case, this is where you would have the different variations of software components. So if I go back to the services, I can see the ones that I own. I sign in as guest, so I'm now a guest user, and I can also then star versus various services that I think are more important for me, so that they show up here, and I can also look at like all the different services that are available in my company. The way we deploy it at Spotify, at least, is that everyone in the company can read and see everyone else's software. So, which is something that our compliance department is absolutely crazy about, and they really like to have one place, single place, to see all the software in the company and all the ownership. From here, I can also then search. I can see playback, simple search. We have not yet implemented site-wide search yet, but that should be fairly straightforward as well. By the way, if someone wants to work on that and help us out to build that, feel free to open an issue and help us out. So similarly, I can see all the websites in our company. We only have 3 websites in the company apparently, but yeah, this is just some example data that we have. Right, so that kind of is the short of it. If I want to see the services that we have, what I also wanted to show, which is now not really fully released yet, so I'm like in a trial branch here, but that's how you create software components. So either you get these files, these software components into the catalog by adding this YAML file to your existing repository, or which is the more sort of the way if you want to create something new, you can use this create component flow. So this is what we call internally at Spotify like golden path templates. So this is also how we make it possible to standardize the way we build software. So as a user, I don't have to copy paste old projects, or I don't have to figure out what is the preferred way to build software at Spotify. And because all of those, the preferred choices are clearly outlined here in the available templates. So if I wanted to create, for example, a new software, let's say this React SSR template, website, I can choose it here. And as a user, the only thing I need to do is demo site. I give it some description. I fill in some information about this. I'm the owner. I can add it as guest so I can see it. This is the path in GitHub. Further down the line, this will be like just a drop down of the available GitHub organizations that I have access to. But for now, web demo. For now, I'm just going to hard code it. And I can review what software I want to create. And then I press create. This actually runs a Docker file that generates the source code for me. It also creates a repository, and then it pushes changes to production. And there we go. Now I've created a new Hello World website, and it's also been registered automatically in the catalog. So I can actually go and look at it. And here we go. So I can see my demo site. It's a website. And then in the future, I will have all my different plugins, basically the tools used to manage this integrated in one place. And I can also see if I go back to the if I go to the websites, here I have my demo site. It's the one that I own. And I can also go and look at it in GitHub. So here's the definition file that was created for me. It's a component and it's a website, and it's owned by the guest user. You can also see here that we automatically generated CI configuration files. So this actually starts building automatically now. Here I can see it in action. Sorry. So yeah, you can see that CI sort of picked this up automatically, and you as an infrastructure organization can define. This is using GitHub Actions as an example, but you could imagine any type of CI configuration files getting created, created automatically for you. And so that users don't have to bother setting up CI. That is already, as soon as you create new software, those are automatically getting picked up and built. Any questions or comments or concerns?
One question there, Stefan. If you imagine an organization who's trying to use Backstage for the first time, what do you think? What are the kind of the setup steps that they need to go from never having Backstage before, or maybe just having it running, to having a pipeline like this set up? What are the things that they need to do outside of Backstage?
So if they wanted to create their, so they would have to set up their templates for sure. That's one of the first things. So we will provide a number of example templates. Actually, this website SSR template that we have is actually pretty much the same that we use inside Spotify. But any company have different standards for how they want to deploy their basically how they want to, what kind of software components they want to use. So if you're building a backend service, you may use Go or a particular Java framework, and you would kind of create your template from and put that up. And I actually forgot to demo one part of this. So we've actually prepared these templates are actually also things that you put inside the Backstage catalog. So I can actually register. This becomes very it's not the very most intuitive demo, but I can actually add new templates to the catalog by registering them in the catalog, which is a little bit meta. But so if I now I've registered another one, and if I go to the create component flow, I can see that I now have a GraphQL service. So if you want to have a GraphQL in your company, that's kind of how you add that to your fresh installation of Backstage. That's
cool.
That's that flow. The other flow would be figuring out how do you put these YAML configuration files in existing software repositories that you have in your company. Either today we don't really have a story for that, except for you creating them manually, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Stefan, what kind of attributes, I mean, the YAML file that you have shown, is that what a company would put, in the steady state, or we will have more attributes or more things to this YAML?
Yeah, good question. I think this is a very bare bones version of this. There's a bunch of other basically attributes that you will put into it, like additional tags and stuff like that. We have created, let's see if I can, we have created an architecture decision record, for outlining how these files will look like. So you can see here, there's an ADR 002 default catalog file format, where you can see more the full examples of all the different things that we expect you to have in this file. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, you will recognize most of these things. We are basically, this is not the exact same format that we're using internally at Spotify. We've actually built what we think is a better, more flexible model, and it's heavily influenced by the Kubernetes custom resource definition file format.
Stefan, do you have some kind of roadmap? What will be the next topics in the catalog area?
Yeah, so what we're working on right now is to finalize this software component flow. Basically, like now you have to just register components. We want to create this, what we call internally the golden path way of creating software. That's like the next big thing. Before we kind of want to call the service catalog into beta, we want to get some more feedback on the format that we have put forward. This exactly what Shashmi, if that's correct. Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Shashi.
We want to get Shashi. Yeah, sorry. If we want to get some more feedback on if this format is suitable, if this maps well to the software that you have in your organization, before we kind of put that into, like, we say that this is the format that we're going for, because ideally we don't want to, that format is kind of a core thing for Backstage. So we want to make sure that we get some initial feedback before we kind of finalize it. Part of that, deciding that format, is also deciding the connection between the plugins, the tools that you add, and that format, and the YAML definition as well. So those are sort of the big things we want to achieve before, or finalize before we call this, before we start to call it beta, I would say. But we think that basically this is the core use case, like making it possible for you to add all your software into a single catalog and to manage those through these different plugins. That's exactly how Backstage is used internally at Spotify, and how we manage microservices inside Spotify. That's what we're shooting for. Okay, so with that, I will leave it over to Emma to demo TechDocs.
Cool, thank you, Stefan. Yes, to give you a little bit introduction of myself first to start with. My name is Emma, and I've been working for Spotify for a year now, and I work in a team called Pulp Fiction, and we own, as Stefan mentioned, one of the popular plugins in Backstage, which we call TechDocs. And so TechDocs really covered the use case of being able to have a docs-like code approach internally. So we want to be able to deliver experience where you can have write your documentation together with your code, and then the TechDocs plugin is where we have a centralized place for all documentation to discover, basically. And so now I think it was last week as we started to plan for open source this and to make it available for the rest of the world to get the same awesome documentation experience as we have internally. So as this is this very early stage, we wanted to just give you a quick demo of what we have been doing until now. So thank you for that, Stefan. Let's see if I can share my screen. So the first version that we're going for is really just the experience in Backstage where you can read documentation that is generated out of mock documentation. So if you go to the Backstage homepage here and then go to the menu and press Docs, you'll get to just a manually curated page here where we have added 2 doc sites. And if we go to, for example, the Backstage documentation, you will get to the documentation for Backstage. You can see that the style sheets are rendering a little bit flaky right now, but it's in progress. But you can at least get a feeling of how you'll read documentation inside of Backstage and navigate around and things like that. And this is a very simplified version of what we have internally. So the TechDocs plugin internally provides a very different experience. So I was thinking I could show you that as well to give you a little glimpse of what you can wait for, kind of. So this is the TechDocs version we have internally. So it's basically the same structure, but you have a little bit more of metadata, who owns the documentation, when it was last updated, who have contributed to it. And then we have kind of a widget architecture for the TechDocs plugin internally as well, where we have different widgets that is standalone React components, basically, that we have been creating with different things. And this is also something that we will open source, but it will be in a version later on. So now we will focus on the reader experience here. But I was thinking I could just show you quickly how to upload just a new site. So we're basically using something called MKDocs, which is an open source static site generator. So when you write your markdown, we use MKDocs to generate static HTML sites. And this internally is something that is happening in the CI. So we're running two Docker containers, which one is they're generating sites, and the other one is publishing. But since we now have a mock documentation experience here, we will just show you quickly from a sample app here how it could look like. So for example, this is just a sample app folder with some mock code files and a docs folder with some markdown files and MKDocs YAML file. With just some configurations. We have been creating an MKDocs plugin that is called the TechDocs Core plugin as a wrapper around other MKDocs extensions. So to simplify that process in the open source version, we want to have one plugin that is kind of a wrapper around all of the extensions and plugins that TechDocs is using. So if I just run upload, I think it should work. This is just the alias that I created that will both run the container, so generate the static HTML files, and upload it to our GCS bucket that we have just created now for this experience. And now it should have been uploaded. And if we go, since this is a manually curated page, it will not exist here now. But if I go to sample app, you'll just see the page I just uploaded here. So just a very quick demo of what we have been doing the last week, and more to come. Do you have any questions? Maybe there is a lot of questions that are circling in your heads, but feel free to ask them. I do have some team members here as well that maybe can answer more.
Emma, this is Emrys Verghese from Fidelity Investments. So quick question, is this feature already available and allowing members like us to actually consume, or are you still in the process of open sourcing this?
Yeah, so we're still, of course, in progress. It's not production ready at all yet, okay. I would say. But I did see this morning, actually, that already some people have been starting to be able to pull their own sites from a AVS bucket. So feel free to experiment with it and feel free to try it out. We have been trying to simplify the configuration of the base URL. So right now we're just we are hosting the sites and reading from there. So if you have hosted sites that are available, feel free to change that configuration and experiment with it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I can speak in one question. So what is subject of such kind of documentation, the entity which is subject of the documentation? Is there conceptually any kind of link between the service catalog items and the subject of this kind of documentation? In the end, is it possible to create links between items in the service catalog and documentation items?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So how it works internally is that all component that is of a production ready state. All components templates are coming with docs as default. So we have 3 different types of docs internally. So we have docs with code. So if you create, for example, as Stefan demoed before, if you create a website, you'll get a doc site for free. And then we have another ownership where you can create a specific docs component. So if you want to have system docs separately from your service, or if you want to create a guide or something for something that is not connected to a service at all, you can do that as well. And that's something we will open source as well. So we will have specific docs components, but you will also be able to get docs with code.
Okay, connecting questions, or 2 connecting questions. So if I, for example, have entities like services, REST services, do we have any specific aspects, facets, for example, API, Swagger documentation, which will be part of those documentation templates, or?
Nothing that we have at the moment. It's something that we're doing research on. I think, Gary, maybe you can jump in and answer that question more, or Stefan, but it is something that we have been getting question on internally as well, but nothing we have at the moment.
Okay, last question.
The short, I think short response to that is that API documentation is something that we think is treated slightly different. It's basically, you typically use, like, let's say, open API specification to write your API specification, and that in turn will also be rendered in Backstage, but in a different view. So what Emma is showing now is kind of the manually written documentation that relates to either a service or a component.
Yeah, okay, but subject of my question was specifically if you plan to do, for example, open API rendering or some kind of plugins for this purpose. So,
yes,
but it's
we do.
down the road. But okay.
Yeah, that's it's actually there's an issue, open issue where a ton of people are interested in that, and we're discussing, like, how to roll that out. What we use internally at Spotify is basically just open API specifications and the rendering of those. So I think that's going to be the first basically use case. So if I go into a service, there's going to be a tab basically there. So it's like, API, you click the API and then you see the open API specification rendered, and also the way you can sort of interact with it. Simple.
Mm-hmm. And I'll take my turn to one last question. Do you plan to reflect on different versions of software artifacts to, in the end, enable stuff like release notes, or is your point of view that this should be subject of a manual written documentation rendered using TechDocs?
We haven't. I mean, what I've been hearing is that for APIs, for certain types of APIs, versioning is really important. So we probably need to think about that going forward. But we haven't at this stage considered versioning TechDocs documentation. But it could be something that we think about. I'm not sure, actually. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We are very fond of what you are doing. So that's...
Yeah, it's fine to ask questions.
Yeah, it's just
really, it's really good feedback for us as well to all of these questions. So,
cool.
I also wanted to highlight, to connect to what I was demoing before, and what Emma said as well. But I think it's an important thing to highlight that whenever what we do with these standardized software templates that I showed. We actually put documentation, sort of the YAML files and the docs folders, etc., that Emma showed. We put those in the templates as well. So regardless of what any software you create at Spotify, you get the way we do documentation. You get that out of the box as well.
Hello, everyone. Can I have a quick question, which relates partially to this part what Emma was demoing. I just want to ask that what you were showing was something that you're using with your team, right? And it had a little bit different layout of the interface. And I'm wondering if the open source version of Backstage is a new version, or if what is basically the difference between the two layouts.
I would
say for documentation specifically, or like, yeah, Emma, go ahead.
That was a good question, though. Specifically for documentation or Backstage in general?
Yeah, I mean for Backstage in general, because I noticed that the layout of the navigation, for example, was in the top bar, and in the new version, it's in the left bar. So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, Stefan.
Yeah, so there are quite a few differences between the open source, like especially some of the layout and stuff like that, and theming and some of those overall navigation elements are different between us. So yeah, there are differences. Those differences are getting smaller and smaller, but there are still differences between.
Okay, and sorry, is there like a version, like a new advanced version, let's say, the open source part?
I think you could look at it like we extracted the best parts of the internal version and sort of have been developing that as the open source version. So there's a bunch of, we have learned a lot of things by having this in production for over 4 years. For example, I mentioned this like component definition file format. We chose another one, or we had another one internally. We have learned what is good about the internal one and what's not good about it, and we're kind of building a better version for the open source. As I also said in the beginning, what we're learning, quite honestly, is that some of the abstractions that we put in place for the internal usage don't really work for open source, because there's like just so much more flexibility needed in order for someone else to kind of adopt this. So there's actually quite a few differences in the overall architecture because of that. Okay, perfect. Thanks for the answer. That was what I was looking for. Thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe maybe the final point there is that we'll be using the open source version internally later, right, Stefan? So it's going to go sort of full circle.
Yes, we're actually merging them step by step today. I saw the first pull requests starting to come in.
There's some questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to be able to pull that up and take a look at them.
Maybe you can read them out, Alex?
Sure. The first one, it says, I saw that you were able to add a service logged in as a guest. Is that a feature of the demo, or is the authentication to GitHub separate from the user?
Yeah, so for this to work, like this is a feature of the demo, basically, or this is like a simplified version. When you deploy this for real, you will require the user to sign in, with their GitHub user or GitLab user in order to create software components on their behalf. So I faked it a bit and used like a default service account here. But typically, what we do internally and what you should do, but yeah, is to create those use the signed in user's token and do the actions on behalf of the signed in user.
The next question is, how does capturing the content from other sites and representing inside Backstage work, if at all? What's the deployment maintenance like? Zero downtime deploys for Backstage itself. And finally, a mention of workflows plugin on Backstage pages. Is that available OSS yet?
I think maybe I can answer the first one, and you will need to take the two last ones, Stefan. But the first one, just a clarifying question: other sites? Do we mean like other sites as docs content from like Google Drive, Confluence, all of these things, or do we mean something else? If we mean that, we are working on like docs together with Co, where you write Markdown, and we don't integrate with Confluence or docs from other sites at all.
That was part of the question. Yeah, I think the other part is if we've got external tools and we want to represent the tools themselves. So say you wanted to take part of GitLab pipelines and present it inside the inside Backstage.
Yeah, what we typically do is we try to ideally we want all the different tools to live like fully fledged in Backstage, but sometimes that's not really realistic, and sometimes it's not worth kind of re-implementing an existing UI just for the sake of it. But what we typically recommend and what teams do is that they build kind of let's say an overview version of a plugin, which kind of gives you the basic information or the most needed tooling in Backstage. And then for users wanting to kind of dig deeper, what we do is that we link out from Backstage. And this has the advantage that you as a team who builds a plugin, you can kind of lean in simply by just building a simple integration initially, and then kind of based on feedback, increase your investment. It also gives users like the confidence that they will be able to find all their tools in one place, regardless of they can always start in Backstage, and then Backstage will kind of link them out to pieces where the tools are not themselves inside Backstage. For example, internally at Spotify, we use tracing, one of the tracing providers, and that's like a pretty advanced UI in itself. And we don't replicate that in Backstage, at least not yet. So, but you can still find sort of the link to your to the tracing tracing information for your specific service linked to from that service in Backstage, if you will, from the Backstage catalog. So I think that hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
I'm seeing here that if we are considering transferring over Backstage to a neutral foundation, funny you should ask. We actually submitted last week a pull request towards basically we're going to donate Backstage to the CNCF. So we're actually in the process of donating Backstage to the CNCF sandbox, and which is the first out of 3 levels. CNCF is the project where the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and we're pretty excited about that. We haven't talked about it yet because it hasn't been adopted yet, but we are we are going to do that if they allow us, which I think they will. You can be clapping as well. That's cool. I didn't know that.
I have one question regarding the Docs as code. Are you thinking about implementing it with a pluggable interface? Because as you are building now, have been demoing now was the MK Docs backend for generating the static content. Are you planning to have a pluggable interface to support other static site generators as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and a question that we have got before. So we decided to start with MKDocs since that is what we use internally. We are open to expand that to other static site generators as well, but it will definitely not be in the first versions, I would say. Gary, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's a good answer.
I think there's a lot of different integration points with Backstage, and for this to become really useful and flexible, we kind of rely on all of you and the community to kind of help out build those things. Like Spotify will not be able to build out all the different variations, but we really hope to ensure we have an architecture that makes it like pluggable in all senses of the word. And similar to how we did with authentication, we don't use every authentication provider at Spotify, obviously, and we will have to rely on different, on the community to build out the ones that are missing, essentially. And that has happened, and I hope that can kind of happen in the even inside plugins like TechDocs. Any more questions? Should we want to keep reading, Alex?
Yeah. One of the questions was, what does the component registration flow look like for existing components regarding, say, GitLab, authorization, access, tokens, etc.? Is it always tied to the user?
Yeah, they're tied to the user. So I didn't show it in this demo because it's not fully baked yet. But when you log in, basically before you create any of these software components, you will be asked to authenticate with your user. So you will get a pop-up like, GitLab or GitHub authentication, and then Backstage frontend will create those components on forward your access token and do the request on your behalf.
And the next question is, I know that you mentioned search briefly. Are you planning to use any search tool, especially for content?
We haven't decided yet, to be honest. What we use internally at Spotify is we put all the content of the service catalog and the software catalog in an Elasticsearch cluster, and then we use that as the backend for search. My guess is that's what we will eventually do for the front end, for Backstage open source as well. But I don't think we have nailed search yet internally at Spotify, if I put it like that. There's still a lot of room for improvements, and we are hoping that other companies maybe have even more experience with this and can help out.
We are hoping to be working on improving the search internally in Backstage next quarter, and of course we're thinking open source at the same time as we start working with that as well. So maybe something comes out of that we can put out in the open. Lost my train of thought there. Sorry. And it includes Backstage components and documentation, sort of both angles.
So internally, we don't have like a one search to rule them all, unfortunately, which is, I guess, where we would eventually want to end up. But yeah, we don't have that yet. I would encourage you, since I don't think we have an open issue for search, like global search, feel free to go and open an issue in GitHub about that, a feature request, and then we can have a conversation about how to progress it.
Yeah.
When will the backend auth documentation be improved? So far, I haven't been able to find information on how to implement it.
Documentation is we know it's not great, and we're actually making we have a plan to make a big push for documentation during not TechDocs documentation, just to be clear. that's Emma and the rest of the team, but the actual platform documentation for Backstage. We're planning to make a push for that during the summer now, and basically have a dedicated documentation site, maybe even using TechDocs, the TechDocs plugin, to sort of showcase that end to end as well. A little bit meta, but we'll see.
Okay,
so for now, I think the best, you're probably better off looking at other example authentication providers like Google and GitLab and the others who have been added. Document code as documentation rather than documentation as code.
Okay, that's the end of our question. Oh, wait, one more. Oh no, that was thank you. You're welcome, Esteban. Any other questions?
It is Ishwar here. So we're from Fidelity. I see 3 or 4 of us have joined in this call. This is our first time we are coming into this forum. And Stefan, thank you for the good work that you guys are doing. It's really inspiring and intrigue all of us to participate in this journey too, right? So it is the nice thing about open source, right? So is this an ongoing forum, Stefan? This weekly connect, or because I got the invite just a few days back from Alexandra, so because I subscribed for it. if this is an ongoing, is that a way for us to participate?
Yeah. By the way, I have seen your email. I will respond to it soon. But yes, this is an ongoing thing. As I said in the beginning, this is the second one we have, but we plan to have, I don't know exactly what cadence we will have these, feedback sessions on. I mean, we're, if you want to talk, like ping us on Discord and we can set up something dedicated, but we stay subscribed to the newsletter and you will be invited to, similar sessions as these as well.
Are there any other questions? We have about 4 minutes left, so you can submit them now.
I have a question otherwise. If there's anything you see now that are kind of, the thing that is blocking you from adopting Backstage.
I can go first, because I just made my first plugin working on my laptop, but nice. It was nice. But the unfortunate thing is, Patrick was there to help us out on the way, otherwise the documentation was not in a way for, an average developer to consume it and get productive right away. I think that is where, if we can put some, not necessarily more documentation, even the video course, just the recorded version of different things set up, very casual, even if it is crude one, no need to beautify it, for all of that stuff, that will be even a great value add, to get hook up and go quickly. I know you guys have several small split up about the overview, but for developers, we need to see the code, so that part will be helpful, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely, I fully understand that. I also hope that, as we are getting more and more plugins added, we have more and more, examples to look at. That has been certainly the way the majority of engineers internally at Spotify has looked like some of them read documentation, but I think most of our plugins have been built by copy pasting good examples, basically. So that will also help. But for sure, we're investing in documentation now.
Stefan, we can help you as well, Stefan. If you get to know that, probably we can put some snippet around and be part of the community too, right? So
absolutely, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
So Stefan, in our case, right, this is Shashi from Toyota, right? So in our case, I really don't know whether it is ready to, I'm just reading through RFCs and, my team is doing it. Unfortunately, they are not familiar with React and, all the stuff. We are reading through code, right? So trying to figure out, and documentation would definitely help. But my question is is it ready to be, installed in production and be used, right? Should we start piloting with a few teams, or there will be more changes, right? Like the catalog XMLs and the YAML and those kind of things that you mentioned.
I think you should expect things to change a bit. Where we are the most mature, I would say, is if you're building a standalone plugin that is not connected to the service catalog, that interface is pretty solid. It's been the same and has been exactly the same as internal one as well. So that's pretty safe, I would say. But as you already mentioned, the service catalog and the definition of the software sort of model, defining the model is super important, we've found. And it's also super tricky. So we are making tweaks to it from the one we have internally to fit in the open source. And I think we will, as more plugins will be built on top of that model, we will need to make smaller changes. So I think right now, you cannot really expect to just deploy Backstage and then start using it as is, and you will have something with that you don't have to touch. I think if you're starting to use Backstage right now, you will have to go in with the assumption that your team that maintains your Backstage deployment will need to make changes along the way over the next few months. I think that's fair to say.
Okay.
But the more people that use it and provide feedback, the faster we will converge on sort of the the stable release, obviously.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Appreciate it. Keep an eye out for a newsletter coming in the next couple of weeks.